Well, I'm really pleased not only to have all of you who are attending to learn about today's discussions, I'm but very thankful to today's speakers, and that's who I have the pleasure of introducing here in just a moment. I'm going to actually introduce all of four of the participating speakers at once, but I just wanted to mention, so the at large focus overall is climate resilience and Canada's national model code construction codes. There'll also be a bit of an expose on the Advisory Council for Harmonized Construction Codes. And now, if you'll permit me, I'll just give you a little bit of a biography for our presenters. So Marianne Armstrong is the initiative leader for the National Research Council of Canada's Climate Resilient Built Environment Initiative. From 2016 to 2020, she managed the Climate Resilient Buildings and Core Public Infrastructure Initiative to integrate climate resilience into Canadian buildings and infrastructure codes, standards, and guidelines. And this work built upon her rich research background relating to residential energy efficiency at the Canadian Centre for Housing Technology. After 1 year as the Director of Stakeholder Engagement and Management with Codes Canada, where she led the research program in support of Canada's national model building codes, she then returned to her passion to define the next 5 years of work on research to support climate resilience in buildings and infrastructure. She is a member of the Professional Engineers of Ontario and holds a Master's of Science in Industrial Design from the University of New South Wales in Sydney and a Bachelor's of Science from Queen's. Thomas Ferguson is the Director of Built Environment Regulations and Specifications at the NRC. Codes Canada, within his directorate, provides administrative, technical, and policy support to the Harmonized Code Development System, including the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, the Advisory Council for Harmonized Construction Codes, and the standing committees who develop the technical code changes. Sefton Hyde-Clark, our third presenter, is the manager of the Code Development System team at Codes Canada at the NRC, and is also the secretary to the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes. His team supports secretarially the work of the Codes Board, who is responsible for the development of the national model codes, including all of their policy work, which right now is focused on climate change, accessibility, emergency responder safety, and impact analysis. In addition, he supports secretarially the Advisory Council for Harmonized Construction Codes. Kevin Griffiths, our fourth participating speaker today, is currently the chair of the Advisory Council for Harmonized Construction Codes, which provides advice on key policy issues related to the national model codes to the Canadian Board for, I should just say CBHCC by now. And Kevin has over 30 years experience in the public service, serving in the administration and management of services related to development and building activities. Prior to his current role, he served as the chair of the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes until its replacement with the CBHCC. And he has served as the chair of the Safety Codes Council for the province of Alberta. And previous to that, he served as the chief building official and director of building services for the city of Calgary. My thanks really, Dan, to you for conceiving of today's session and an opportunity for us all to become, I think, more richly informed about this really essential and important system by which we have building standards and codes governed. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over in that order. Marianne, to you to start.
Great. Thanks so much, Chad, for the introduction. I don't have a formal presentation, but I'm here to set a little bit of context for today's presentation. So certainly it's something that comes up frequently when we talk about climate resilience is let's put it in the code. Let's use the code as an instrument to achieve our resilience goals. And I think one thing that we sometimes forget is that the code is just one piece of that larger puzzle. When we look at codes, they have a role to play. And I think that's why this presentation today is so important, so we can learn about the specific role that codes plays in the resilience space alongside a lot of the other policy instruments at our disposal. So it has a very specific role to play. And I think that's why learning more about the codes, about the objectives of the codes, about how the codes work, how to engage with codes is so very important for this space. So I've been here a few times as a member of IBWG speaking to the research that we're doing on climate resilience. So there's a lot of work ongoing at the NRC, and NRC also supports the development of the National Building Code. So that's another important piece of the work we do at our research center. In terms of the research right now, we're at a point where we've been working in this space for about 7 years, where we've developed a suite of information, including standards, guidelines on resilience to extreme events, as well as wildfires, or sorry, as well as extreme events, as well as climate change, including as well wildfires. But we're also right now at the point where we have things such as future climate data that we're seeing now moving into the code system. We're starting some of the policy discussions about what is the role of the codes in addressing some of these other areas. But at the same time, we have the opportunity to take those guidance and take those standards to build resilient construction. So there's nothing stopping us now from being able to build above and beyond what's in the codes. So I think we have to keep that in mind too, as we look at the role of the codes in achieving our goals on resilience. So I'm really pleased today to have with us Thomas Sefton as well as Kevin, who have put together a wonderful presentation that will walk us through really how the codes work, also the recent transformation of the codes, which is seeking to improve harmonization of codes as well as timely adoption across the country. So some really wonderful work has happened over the last few years, which has changed the way the codes are now being developed, hopefully, and I would say definitely for the better. So they'll be speaking to that a little bit. And I think there's also an important piece of the puzzle is how can we get engaged as a community, as part of the IBWG? How can we be better involved in the code system and help inform the discussions as they move forward and be part of developing regulation in Canada? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas Sefton and Kevin to get started with their presentation.
Thomas, I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind, and I'll walk through the whole presentation. If you want to start and do introductions, I'll just get the screen up here.
Sounds good.
Here it comes. I think you should see it now.
So you just want to go to the content slide, Sefton. I'll give everyone a bit of a preview of how we'll break this down. So we'll be alternating speaking here between Sefton and I, and Kevin will go at the end and give you a bit of an update on the advisory council. So as Marianne was indicating, we'll provide a bit of an overview of the codes, the function they play, how they're structured, et cetera, to give you a bit of an understanding. Sefton will take you through that. He's the expert when working and steeped in this domain for a number of years, and also, as Marianne said, has the benefit of currently working on the policy files, which includes climate resilience or adaptation, as one of the areas that's being looked at to see what the role of the codes is in each of these areas, and what additional provisions could be developed as we go forward. So then I'll take you through the harmonized code system. So we've just had a recent governance transition from the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes, which coincidentally Kevin used to chair as well, actually, which developed codes independently, to now a more government-led process. And so I'll take you through the details of that. And that has some general implications as far as closer connectivity between government agendas and what's in the code. So you'll see the code being used more and more, shall we say, as an instrument to articulate and achieve public policy outcomes. Then we'll take you through a little bit of how code development works, and we'll take you through that. I'll talk then a little bit about the resilience in the national model codes, what's being worked on now, and how the 2030 planning is being approached. And then we'll have a piece from Sefton on how to get involved with closing thoughts or closing update from Kevin. So with that, Sefton, I would say take it away, and we'll really look forward to your questions as we go. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. So before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge Anne Gribben, who's on the call today. She's put together this presentation for us, and I think she did a very great job. So I'm excited to give this to you. As Thomas mentioned, we're going to start with just a little bit of it's almost like a 101 on the code system and the national model codes themselves. It helps us frame the context of the policy discussions that we have. As Marianne mentioned, trying to establish what the role of codes is going to play on when we're talking about climate change. So understanding what the codes are is kind of a good first step, and that's kind of why Thomas and I are going to be bouncing back and forth between discussing these different elements throughout the presentation, just to sequence the presentation a little bit better. So the National Model Construction Codes, here we're looking at the 2020 publication, which is the most recent publication for the Building Code, the Energy Code, Fire Code, and the Plumbing Code. Just to give you a little bit of a history, under our first constitution, the building and fire safety regulation was a provincial and territorial responsibility. So sort of how did we get here today where NRC, this federal government agency, is involved in code development? Well, back in 1937, there wasn't a national or provincial or territorial construction code. Everything was regulated through each municipality, from city to city and township to township, was using different set of regulations to regulate construction in their jurisdiction. But that made life difficult for developers and contractors who had to deal with different regulations, and also the insurance and mortgage sectors, that in that there wasn't one sort of minimum set of requirements that could be consistently applied throughout Canada, and made it difficult for insurance and for financing. So to address this, Canada decided to harmonize construction requirements throughout the country, and NRC was chosen to develop a national model construction code. This looks like a blank slide. I don't know what's going on there. Oh, okay, so it had a pop-up. So it wasn't until the national model codes come into effect. They're not regulation, they're model codes. So they only come into effect once they're adopted into law by a province or territory. The national model codes are really a minimum acceptable measures required to achieve the objectives in the code. And so what does that mean? It means that the codes only contain requirements that the federal, provincial, and territorial, I'll try and pause as we go through because we use a lot of acronyms, and FPT is one of them. FPT meaning federal, provincial, and territorial. It contains the requirements that the federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions and the code users community thinks needs to be put into regulation. The code doesn't address everything. I will speak to that a little bit later in the presentation, but so the code doesn't get into every characteristic of how to design every component within a building. So for example, the code doesn't address aesthetics. It doesn't address privacy, like private security. It doesn't address protection of building contents, nor does it address the safety of the construction workers themselves. But these issues are addressed in other ways, through other regulations and through other mechanisms, either at the provincial level or through municipal bylaws, for example. But that doesn't mean that because the code doesn't address something in full, doesn't mean that it doesn't do anything for those different areas. So I have a couple of examples. Noise protection is something that is addressed through the code. However, it only addresses certain types of sound transfer. It addresses airborne sound transfer, but only between dwelling units. It doesn't really address structure-borne noise, nor does it address exterior noise. So there's sort of an example of where we do address in part an issue, but not in full through the code. In terms of applications for the codes really cover design, construction, occupancy for all new buildings, alterations, reconstruction, demolition, removal, relocation, and occupancy of all existing buildings as well. Just a sneak peek looking into the 2025 codes. We're also working on a new section in the codes that will deal with alterations to existing buildings. I'm gonna try. Oh, sorry, I should have been scrolling through this as I'm speaking. So these are the points that I just highlighted. In terms of NRC's role, the National Research Council has been a partner with Canada's provinces and territories for more than 75 years. We have a very positive history of collaboration. And throughout our time, we've hosted this national code development system, and we've guarded its integrity and the interests of the provinces and the territories and their regulation of construction. The federal, provincial, and territories have designed this code development system to be open to all views and transparent in its proceedings and accessible to everyone. Decisions are made through consensus by the technical committees that are balanced by region and also by interest categories. The NRC supports those decisions of those technical committees with research and evidence. And thank you to Marianne for all of the work she's currently working on to support the technical committees. NRC also assists the committees with subject matter experts and supports each of the code changes with impact analyses that are developed for the technical committees. NRC is also the publisher of the national model codes, which are available for free for electronic download or for purchase in print format. I mentioned before that the codes are the National Building Code, the National Fire Code, the National Plumbing Code, the National Energy Code for buildings. We also publish related user guides in English and French for the Part 9 Illustrated User's Guide, the Structural Commentary, and the User Guide for the Energy Code. In terms of benefits for our national harmonized model codes, just in the context of harmonizing nationally the codes, all building codes can create safe, healthy, and accessible and energy efficient in the built environment, but only through a national harmonized code will we really see the economic benefits in addition to those different objectives. So the national model codes really is a way for increasing productivity for Canada's industry as well. So just a couple of examples. The plumbing industry is estimating that harmonizing requirements for water heaters across Canada could save manufacturers and consumers, multiple millions of dollars each year, and that's just with one product. And the code is helps also with a harmonized code, also helps with interprovincial trade and just creates new different markets. A couple of other examples, the 2015 code permits wood buildings up to 6 stories, and that opens up a new multi-million-dollar market in Canada. Of course, we're also focused on health and safety improvements as well. So, for example, the 2015 codes increase the step dimensions to make steps safer, and that'll lead to what was estimated to a prevention of over 13,000 falls on stairs just in the first 5 years, and that has its own economic impact or benefit in Canada. So in terms of codes and guides, today's construction technologies and techniques differ vastly from those that were implemented at the time of the first National Building Code, which was produced in 1941. So just to keep pace with all of those changes in technology and to make sure that the latest innovations and applications are applied safely by the construction industry, a new edition of the National Building Code is published approximately every 5 years. NRC now publishes all of the model codes every 5 years, the latest version of those being the 2020 editions, with the exception of the National Farm Building Code, which is still 1995. I've also mentioned the different users guides that were being produced as well. In terms of the code itself, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the code, and it's what we call objective-based codes. In 1995 to 2005, the codes migrated from what used to be a prescriptive code into what is now considered an objective-based code, which is an objective-based code being a mixture of prescriptive and performance requirements but it also helps the code users and regulators understand the intent behind the different requirements, and that helps with both design and evaluations of alternative solutions. And that's how we can, in addition, help support innovation. So in terms of the objectives themselves, there are 5 different areas that the code currently focuses on: safety, health, accessibility, fire and structural protection of the building, and the environment. Using these objectives, the code allows for alternative solutions to bring new products new innovative products into the code. I won't dwell on this for too long, but the objectives and then their sub-objectives are laid out into the code. Every technical requirement is linked to at least one or more sub-objective. And it was in 2005 when the objectives and their sub-objectives were developed and introduced in the code and then linked to all of the technical requirements. In addition to objectives, you'll often hear what is the objective and functional statement pairing. So objectives are paired with what are called functional statements, and the functional statements are also part of the code. And through the functional statements, they're really telling you how to achieve the stated objective through those technical requirements. So every technical requirement is going to have an objective and functional statement pairing. A couple of quick examples to exemplify the difference between prescriptive and performance. So again, our objective-based codes has a mixture of these different requirements. These are 2 current requirements in the code, one on door latches, which is very prescriptive. A door needs to be equipped with a device, a positive latching mechanism that has a design to serve a particular purpose. Whereas performance requirements might ask you to design a system, or in this case, design the building in a way that you can limit the smoke movement from one area to another, and you don't want smoke getting into your exit stairs. So, they're using performance requirements to define what the performance is without prescriptively telling you exactly how to build it or design it. So that's sort of the what is the National Model Codes 101. I think we will hand it over to Thomas, and he's going to talk to you about the transformation and the harmonized code system. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Efton. I'll just comment generally before we get into this. I see the kind of comment in the chat from Christine Kalihu on codes being a piece of the puzzle, but a rather onerous and time-consuming approach. I just wanted to address that because I think it's germane to the conversation today. In a sense, you can think of the code development process as a very high quality process that works in a stepwise fashion, engaging through consensus-based and public approach that engages a lot of the relevant experts, the communities, the stakeholders, the provinces and territories, her regulators, and moves in a rigorous and stepwise fashion towards changes within the national model codes that can be then adopted within the provinces and territories. And so because of the many players involved, the volunteers and the government officials, the regulators, the stakeholders, or the industry, et cetera, there's a lot of value from that. We get a lot of value from public review. The code changes are developed, put out for public review. Often there are insightful comments. And so it does work slowly, if you will, in a sense, but there's a reason for that, and it results in high quality. As Marianne said, the code in of itself doesn't necessarily preclude other construction approaches beyond the codes being looked at and implemented, and as well a statistic that is sometimes raised that's helpful for framing is that the codes do concern themselves, for the time being at least, with new construction, and that represents only about 1 or 2% of the construction activity in Canada. Now, as was mentioned earlier by Sefton, the alterations to existing buildings is something that's being looked at, and so the codes would then become triggered in certain renovations, and so would have more general applicability. But by and large today, for the existing building stock, it doesn't necessarily address what's being done there. And so just to keep in mind the kind of limitations and purpose of the instruments that we're talking about, I thought I would mention that. Also, Chad and his group, working with Marianne, are looking at ways of putting the various standards that are being developed out there, the toolkits, so that can be used by designers. We're looking at mechanisms for early federal implementation. There's also in another part of my group, the Canadian Construction Materials Center, and we're looking at the potential for qualifying materials and products to be above codes, as well as one of the potential avenues. And so we're looking at this public policy issue from all sides and to see what we can do. And the code has a role to play, but it's not the only instrument, as has been articulated. So with that, Sefton, if we could get into the slides. I'll provide you an overview, I guess, secretarially of the changes that have taken place. My role, as was described by Chad, is the director for the group that provides the secretarial support. So I don't speak on behalf of the board, but this is kind of their stock engagement presentation that describes the change. So in Canada, the provinces and territories have the constitutional mandate to regulate and enforce construction for buildings and houses. So the NRC, we are the publisher and provide secretarial support. In 2020, there was an agreement, a reconciliation agreement to further harmonize regulation as part of the Regulatory Reconciliation and Cooperation Table. And so this is under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. It had an economic basis that you would improve on economic inefficiencies of having different regulation across the country. So until last fall, the code development, as I indicated earlier, codes were developed by the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes, which I'll describe in a second. And since last fall, then there was a switch over to a federal, provincial, territorial-led system. So next slide, Sefton. So what you had in the past, just for those who are familiar, you recognize this, just to give you a bit of a snapshot, is you had the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes, CCBFC, the top right-hand side bubble, was the executive level committee, essentially, that approved the changes to the codes. Thanks, Sefton. Then you had the system of standing technical committees, energy efficiency, fire protection, et cetera, that were responsible each for a section of the model code books and are responsible for developing changes to be proposed for approval by the CCBFC. The PDPAC, the Provincial Territorial Advisory Committee on Codes, on the top left, was where the provinces and territories provided policy advice to the code development system, including on which priorities should be undertaken and on matters of policy that impact the regulation. And so in a sense, today the roles have been reversed to a degree where you have governments in centrally leading the code development system, and we're engaging the stakeholder community, industry, et cetera, via the advisory council, which Kevin will speak to. So you can see in the marginal notes there that the code development system draws on the efforts of over 300 volunteers. It's a significant effort, and that continues today. We have maintained the technical committees in their existing form, and they're the lifeblood, essentially, of developing the code changes. And you have NRC in the background providing secretarial support. So next slide. So today, the model is as you see on the screen. So in the green shape there, the hexagon, you've got the CBHCC, the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, essentially replaces the CCBFC as the direction setter and approver of the codes. It is overseen by the Canadian Table for Harmonized Construction Codes Policy, which is a federal, provincial, territorial, deputy minister level committee that sets the overall strategic priorities for codes and keeps and has accountability for development of codes, where the board is responsible for developing an implementation plan against those high-level priorities and approving the changes for the model regulation. We have the technical committees in red at the bottom, which in their current capacity are the standing committees that used to report to the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes. there is some consideration for potentially changing the structure and format of those committees in the future. I can speak to that if you wish, but I don't think it's a central topic for today. It'll be some sort of variation on the theme, probably a reorganization in order to better focus on priority work. Then you have to the right-hand side, the Advisory Council, which Kevin will speak to you about, which is there to advise on policy and implementation considerations. And I see there are a couple of members on the line today, so nice to have that integrated perspective. And then the codes community at large, the code users, et cetera, who are able to receive updates by attending the public meetings of the board, which happen on a quarterly basis. And they're provided debriefs and can provide input as well as changes are approved. Next slide. So the rationale for the change in governance is that the provinces and territories have generally adopted the model codes, but have not necessarily done so in along the same timeframes. Certain jurisdictions are still referencing 2010 or 2015 codes in the current context, and that in and of itself provides a bit of a difference in the regulation. There are oftentimes also substantive variations between the provincial codes and the model codes, creating again inconsistencies across the country. So the thought was that if the provinces and territories were involved in the governance, priority setting, decision making around the codes, there would be a greater likelihood of full adoption of the codes. And so what has happened here, and again, it's the economic rationale that this can result in increased construction costs and barriers to manufacturing operation, inspection and education and training as well, with the complexities and differences. Next slide. So the commitments under the reconciliation agreement were to harmonize, which I spoke to, eliminate or reduce technical variations, to adopt in a more timely manner. So now you have a commitment to adopt the 2020 codes within 24 months and subsequent codes within 18 months, and to transform the system to better meet the needs. And that's the governance change I spoke to you about. There was also a commitment which has been already carried out, which is to make the digital form of the national codes freely available. Next slide. So as far as mandates, just to get into a little bit more specifics to help you understand the policy table, which is the deputy minister's level representatives, the overall will help drive towards harmonization, ensure that co-development supports policy mandates. And when we think about the dialogue that happens at that level, they begin to discuss a little bit of the code as it fits into the broader picture, and looking at what role the code can play and how it connects with other efforts, government and otherwise. So provide guidance on key issues at a high level. So as I said, the general direction setting. And then the board itself, the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes, is more of a working level. It ranges from senior advisor to assistant deputy minister level. So a bit of a range depending on the size of the teams within the jurisdictions, and are there to operationalize the high level strategic priorities that are set by the deputy minister's table. So these work by both of these committees work by a consensus. There's a co-chairing relationship where the NRC, an official from the NRC, and an official from the provinces and territories co-chair, and the provincial territorial seat rotates, and there's one vote per jurisdiction. So in some cases, building and fire, for example, in Ontario is split, and so they have two people attending these meetings, but only one vote. Next slide. So next steps in the immediate future, obviously the work for developing the 2025 codes is underway. We're in actually the final stretches of the first iteration of the proposals are due by this fall in October, and then we'll be into the public reviews, and following that, any changes that result from the public review, and finally publication in 2025 for the 2025 codes. So for this year, looking ahead to the 2025 to 2030 code development cycle, the table is in the process of setting the priorities. And so they met in May and discussed the high level strategic priority areas that could be undertaken for the 2030 codes. and are in the process of writing up that direction, and we'll be providing it to the board within the coming weeks. We had a sneak preview of those with the advisory council yesterday. That the chairs presented and gave a bit of an update on what had transpired. I'll just say, I won't go through all of that, but I would say that climate resilience or climate change adaptation was considered to be one of the priorities for the future codes, and I'll speak a little bit about the specifics of that later. And so any general policy question will be looked at as well. And the chairs here in this case, as I said, there's a co-chairing relationship. So Ian Stewart, who's the president of the NRC, works with Gloria Donnet from Saskatchewan on this. Next slide. So, the board itself assumed responsibility, as I said, for the code system in November. The existing work continues through the existing committees, and a new committee structure will be designed. Probably sometime this year, we'll release the details. We haven't actually put our minds yet to exactly what it will look like. It's the structure is to be informed by the strategic priority areas, and so one element informs the other. And this is a committee co-chaired by Trevor Nightingale, who's the Director General of the Construction Research Center here at the NRC, and by Joe Rogers in Nova Scotia. Just so you have a sense of the priority setting process, where it stands at a high level. So the policy table met, as I said, in May, and they'll provide direction to the board. The board's job then over the coming months will be to put a little bit of detail on what we could achieve or what could be worked on within the 2025 to 2030 code cycle in each of the strategic areas. Along the way, there will be dialogue with the advisory council. In particular areas, there's been a discussion on generating roadmaps, which the advisory council would have a big role to play in supporting the development of the industry perspective around that. And so that will all inform another discussion by the deputy minister's policy table in the fall, where they will ultimately bless, if you will, the priorities and, generally speaking, what the work will look like. Then next year, we'll roll up our sleeves even further and start to develop the detailed tasks, roll out the committees, recruit the volunteers, et cetera, in order to be ready to go in early 2025 to start the work for the 2030 codes. And so it is a process, but it's well organized, and we're working in a stepwise fashion and looking to be inclusive along the way as to what work will be done and have a range of perspectives brought to bear on the work. So Seth, I think that might be it. Is there another slide? Nope, over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Thomas. So we're back to me, and I'm going to talk about the code development system. So Thomas gave you a very high-level overview of the code development system. I'll get into a little bit more of the detail. I'll talk about some of the policy, technical, and the maintenance in the minor work. In terms of the process itself, this is just showing a little bit of the transition from one, maybe I can call it phase, to the next as we progress through code development. It really starts with a policy lens, and not every issue that we deal with has a policy lens, but if it does, the codes board does all of that policy work, and it sort of overlaps into discussions around through those policy discussions. What role does codes play? It's an implementation choice, but it's not the only one. And then we start scoping the work out sort of at that technical level, and determining the objectives. That sets direction to the technical committees that start on the technical development and start building solutions into the codes as proposals. And each proposal is paired with an impact analysis, and that sort of high level sort of shows you that process. There are different steps. I'll get into it in the next slide, but this is the process for. I should clarify. This is the process for expanding the objective of the code, or expanding the scope of the code. Is through this step process. In terms of technical changes, it looks very similar. I know we've described it a little bit different here, but a lot of the steps are the same, except we don't need all that upfront policy work, because there isn't any real policy work for making a technical change that fits within the scope of the codes. So This looks a little small on my screen. I hope everyone can read it, but it sort of reads left to right, showing the process where at the very beginning, there's planning for the code cycle, where we're setting strategic direction. Thomas already explained a little bit on how that takes place. And then we get into a bit more of a detailed work planning. That's where we get into the nitty gritty of what technical work we're going to be working on. The third box right in the middle is developing changes. So this is where the technical committees are actually creating different proposed changes. From their developing proposed changes, this is where the code cycle actually begins. So all of that work planning goes up ahead of starting the code cycle. So we want to get the ball rolling before we actually hit 2025 to start up. So we've completed setting the strategic direction. We've done the work planning, and now we're ready to actually work on the technical changes. That's the model that we have here. And in that change development, the technical committees, all proposed changes go out for a fourth step of public review. That's where the public at large has an opportunity to comment on the public review. Thomas mentioned how this process seems thorough. I would agree it is thorough, but it does actually make for high quality products. We receive lots of good input, not just from industry, but also from code users everywhere on the proposed changes that the committees are proposing. And all of those comments go back to those technical committees. So we even have a little bit of a feedback loop here where the public review comments could lead to further change development if it's warranted. And so the technical committees will do that. It might lead to future work that needs to be done in that same space. So the feedback loop goes all the way back to even work planning that could lead to future work that carries over into the next code cycle. And then after the committees are sort of satisfied from their perspective, and all the comments from the public review have been addressed, we finally end with publication. As Thomas mentioned, it would be up to the codes board to make that final call on the publication of the new codes and what goes into it. In terms of code change assessments, evaluating what goes into a code, there are some very basic principles that are followed when we're assessing changes to the code. Not every code change request that we receive gets actioned into a change in the code. So this sort of helps us sort of understand what becomes a higher priority and what may become a lower priority, which may lead to something being developed in the code and may lead to something not being developed in the code. So we're looking at issues that are widespread issues that aren't like very localized issues or just an isolated situation. Definitely want to pay attention to serious health and safety concerns. Some items that are lower risk or very low probability of occurrence might be a lower priority. If something is very likely to occur, that would be a higher priority item versus something that does not happen very often. Minimum acceptance practice, or is something a best practice? Is it like a guide, or is this sort of the minimum standard we should be applying everywhere? Is another oops, I don't know how that happened. Sorry. And then also sort of from that policy perspective, is there a need to regulate everything in the codes? Not always. There are often other more effective instruments. So that might also sort of weigh in on whether something is a higher priority or a lower priority. And then is there industry and provincial territorial support, or is just this like sort of an individualized issue might also lead to different items being higher or lower priority. I should also mention that no one of these items looked in isolation would determine the priority of any given topic of discussion. In terms of the harmonized code development system, we would describe it as being open, transparent, a continuous process where code changes can be submitted at any time. The focus of the committees is to create consensus as the proposed changes are being written. There are hundreds of public review comments that we receive on proposed changes. The standing committees, as I mentioned, address all of these public review comments. Those discussions take place at public meetings where those commenters are free to attend the meeting and speak directly to the technical committees. I should also mention that the technical committees that discuss these technical changes are have a balanced matrix, so their membership is actually a balanced representation of between different different interest categories like general interests and regulatory and industry, as well as representing a balance across the different regions in Canada, from East Coast to West Coast and North to South. And the last thing I'll mention on this slide here is that the Codes Board sets the workload for each of the technical committees through work plans, is how it was done under the CCBFC. I think we're still calling it a work plan exercise under the Codes Board in terms of the 2030 code. That each technical committee will have an action item mandate or work plan, you could say, of items that they would be responsible for developing in the context of the 2030 codes. Thomas, I believe it's back over to you for climate resilience.
Yep, and I'll take this opportunity to just address a couple of the questions in the chat as we keep moving. So, question from Catherine on sharing the slides. Yes, we've provided those to Dan, so they could be shared around from our perspective. Kurt, you had a question around the involvement of Engineers Canada. So, Kevin, you may wish to respond to that when you start, when you speak. Question is, have we reached out? Is there consideration of including Engineers Canada in the advisory council? And then Pam, you asked about the bounds of the priority setting process. Is funding the rate limiter on it? I would say that is part of it. I mean, our team is only so large. We have about 30 technical advisors who support the volunteers. So it's the time of the volunteers, the capacity of the technical team. We are looking at mechanisms for increasing the speed of code development. There are some provincial territorial led changes, for example, harnessing their capacity. And so we're looking at early federal implementation of things as well before codes are fully out in certain areas. We have benefited from funding from your department on the mitigation side of things, from NRCan, with some core funding that has permitted some of the research work and also some of the and we've brought in some of the capacity on the technical side. So so yeah, generally speaking, there's a triage where priorities have to be set, because it won't be possible to do everything within a given cycle. Also, an important consideration is industry readiness, and that's where the advisory council plays a big role as far as readiness for implementation and having discussions about what might be needed in order to support industry and getting ready, I think is going to be a really critical feature of the system. And Kevin can speak to that. So with that, Sefton, if you could toggle to the next slide. I'll just briefly cover what's being done. And so want to convey a sense that we're working closely with the NRC research with colleagues at Infrastructure Canada on helping inform the agenda for codes. And so when the priorities were set for 2025, Marianne put together some information on the various standards, guidelines, et cetera, that had been developed as a result of the research in order to inform what was ready to be addressed. And given the time limited cycle that we had, we were playing a bit of catch up for the 2025 codes. It was determined by the board. Well, I guess, but PDPAC advised the CCBFC at the time, but now the board, that future climatic design data would begin to be used, and that overheating was a critical task that needed to be addressed by the codes. And so that's the focus for now for the 2025 codes, which, as I said, the bulk of the work will be completed by this fall. For 2030, then, building on all the wonderful standards, guidance, et cetera, that has come out, the question is, what do we integrate into the codes? So which elements make sense to bring into the code, which is the minimum baseline document? And so really there's a policy working group that's looking at the various areas, wind, flooding, et cetera, to determine what more could be done or what could be done within the codes. And so in parallel, the advisory council will be having a dialogue throughout the coming months to give its perspective on things, and we'll begin to slot where the code fits as part of the broader array of instruments out there, and trying to develop a coherent strategy. And so we'll be involving Marianne very much in this work, given that it's more than just about the codes, obviously. So that's where we stand right now. So more details to come, but there'll be lots of discussion to figure this out. Thanks a lot. Sefton, back over to you.
Thanks, Thomas. I just have 2 more slides here to help us understand how to get involved in the code development system. So I've listed a couple of them here. Well, I've listed all of them here. Anyone is able to, at any time, submit a code change request. Every code change request is looked at through the code system. You can also attend meetings. Most of the meetings in the code system are open to the public. So the advisory council, for example, meets in the public, and you can attend advisory council meetings. The codes board meets, Thomas mentioned this before, but the codes board meets quarterly in public. The technical committees that develop the codes, they always meet in public. So you're able to attend all of those technical discussions through public meetings. The technical committees will also strike sub committees. We call them task groups, and the task groups, they also meet in public. So even if you're not a member, most of these meetings, at least currently, are done virtually anyway. So anyone is able to attend, and I would say they're well attended, these meetings, by members of the public. You can also participate in the code development system through submitting comments on proposed changes through our public reviews. I have a little bit more on public reviews on the next slide. And as well, you can submit your candidacy for becoming a member of those technical committees. And I would point out as well that you don't have to be a subject matter expert to become a member of a technical committee. All different backgrounds and perspectives are considered when forming those technical committees. And usually it's more beneficial even to have a balance of different perspectives on the technical committees. Again, they're balanced between the different interest groups, regulatory, industry, and general interest, as well as diversity across the different regions in Canada. So all of this information, it's currently on our website, which hasn't migrated yet to the new website for the codes board. So it's currently under the CCBFC website. But you can find more information there. And maybe I'll after this slide, I'm finished projecting the slide. I should mention also I can't see the chat while I'm projecting on the screen. So thank you, Thomas, for monitoring that. But after this is finished, I'll post the link to the website so you can go there and you can see all this information there. And my last slide here, I just wanted to highlight a couple of key dates coming up in case you were interested in participating in some of these meetings I'm talking about, or some of these processes I'm talking about. In terms of public review, the next public review, we just finished one. So the next one coming down the pipeline is set for, we're calling it Fall 2023 Public Review, and it's set for October 17th, and it'll run for 2 months until December 18th. There is another one after that, and I forget when that starts. I think it's sometime into the next 2024. I think it's a February-ish timeframe. In terms of code change requests, you can submit a code change request at any time. There's nothing stopping you from submitting a code change request, but we do have to have a cutoff when we're considering planning for the upcoming code cycles. So in terms of planning for the 2030 code cycle, CCR's code change requests that are received before June 2024 will be integrated into that consideration for the upcoming 2030 code cycle planning. CCR submitted after that June 2024 deadline still get analyzed and still get looked at, but we're looking into the, at that point, 2035 code cycle, unless there is something that is, we'll say, critical, like a life safety issue, in which case the codes board would maybe take a different direction. And in terms of some of the upcoming meetings, we have an upcoming meeting coming very, very soon on June 15th. In a couple of weeks, the codes board is going to have one of their quarterly public meetings. If you skip to the last line, they meet again in public in September on the 21st. So those would be the next two public meetings. The third one after that would be at the end of the year, and it's a day in December that I don't think has been determined. Excuse me. And in terms of the next advisory council meeting, I'll maybe let Kevin speak to it a little bit more, but I did want to put it on this list to put it on your radar that they just met, by the way, this week, yesterday, and their next meeting is looking to be in sometime in July, exact date to be determined. So with that, I think I will hand the floor over to Kevin, who has been very patient, and he will talk to us about the advisory council. Kevin is the chair of the advisory council. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Sefton, and appreciate this opportunity. I'll move fairly quickly through this so it allows time still for questions from your members. So the advisory council is already sort of touched on by Thomas, is there to really provide opportunity to be involved for stakeholders who are obviously users of the code or who are affected by it and want to obviously participate in the development of code. The mandate of the advisory council is, just as it's described, to provide advice to the decision makers who are the board or CBHCC. And we stay at a fairly high level, obviously, key policy issues, strategic priorities, and the direction that is set for the code cycle, and as well an overall view of how that may be implemented and any challenges and opportunities around that. So again, code users and interested ones who want to participate are members, and I'll get into that here right away. I'll go to the next slide. So our membership, who's in, it's a very large group, not unlike yourselves. We have 39 associations that are now identified as members. The question that was asked was about Engineers Canada. And again, that group is very much desired to be a part of the discussion. We have met with their senior team, and they are pursuing whether or not the membership would support the involvement and be able to participate. So we're anxious to look at hearing back from them. But I will say that the design community, the engineers as a profession, have been historically great contributors to the code development system and are very much looked to and desired to be part of the discussion on setting priorities. So again, we have already some organizations represented or participating that have some engineering in them. But again, Engineers Canada, we are excited to have them on board if that is supported by their members. So again, you can see that there's a sort of a broad spectrum of interest. Code users, the municipal authorities, and as you probably realize, they are the ones that actually implement the codes. They're adopted provincially, and then they are enforced and utilized municipally. So key players. Emergency responders, obviously the fire departments, fire chiefs, producers of materials that are used by the code. You know, our core materials that have historically been part of the code development system, those associations are with us. Constructors, the builders, and also other interest groups. Standards Council of Canada are now members, which is a tremendous add. And again, others who are interested, it might be consumer groups, for example, are there representing health interests and others. So again, it's a broad spectrum that gives us a deeper understanding and ability to really inform the board of the perspectives of stakeholders. Others are welcome. I think Septon just touched on it. These are public meetings, and so observers are welcome. And again, based on the weight of the discussion, number of participants, we invite, again, observers to participate as appropriate. So again, these are open meetings, and we have those meetings posted for when they're occurring as well on the, it's still on the CCBFC site, but will be on the new site as we go forward. In the next slide. So the capacity for us to contribute with advice to the board is a very important role, and one we take very seriously as an advisory council. We have, as I said, a very broad range of perspectives. We're not looking for a vote or requiring to have consensus. But having said that, through our discussions, and we've had 4 meetings now, we do see that in many cases, there's an amplified perspective. So we can distill back to the board a thought of what is supported by the majority, but we don't look for a vote. And at the same time, we do share in its fullness the thoughts of those that are on the advisory council, even if they are contrary to maybe the majority of those who sit on the council. So all advice is provided, and as well helps the board see the broader spectrum of thought on any given topic. It is the chair's responsibility, my responsibility, to be at these board meetings and provide them with this information. But it again is the representation of the thoughts, collective thoughts of the council. There's one coming up here this week, a meeting. And as was mentioned, we just had our meeting of the advisory council. And we like to do that, obviously, to be able to have the most current thoughts of the council available to the board when they meet. We'll go to the next one. So as I said, 4 meetings already. Great effort was done by the council to be ready for the board so that the board could also have the thoughts of the council when they present to the table. And the table meeting, as Thomas said, indicated, happened in May here. So a lot of work was done. And priorities that came forward that obviously the advisory council supported or amplified in their minds that were important. First and foremost, climate change was something that the members of council, again, as we're hearing from yourselves and communities at large, a big concern, both with regards to adaptation and as well mitigation. Accessibility, so the codes are looking at as well how to be socially inclusive of all in the community. And so how can the built form better serve that? Performance-based codes, this is something that's been in place for a while, but really looking at the ability to transfer knowledge and the ability to adopt and effectively implement codes. This is a big challenge, actually, because to create code is only part of it. And so we need to be able to have implementable codes that are used and are beneficial to those that need them. Agility. I'm seeing some of your comments already reflecting that to move more quickly. That was a common theme and comment from the advisory council. Again, the adjustments to the system are in place as well to provide a better quality, more harmonized approach, but also to give agility and to be able to move more quickly, but on balance to do so in a way that's sustainable and supportable going forward. Greenhouse gas emissions, we've had already an opportunity to comment twice just this week again on the policy recommendations. 2 waves of public consultation has gone through. I can say that again, our comments are at a high level with regards to how they can be implemented, the focus around that, and happy to answer more questions on that. But I think they're in general making sure that we understand how the issues will be addressed and the timing on that, and so that industry and code users can be ready as we go forward to be able to implement effectively. What we've seen is obviously we have a very large group in the council, so to have deeper discussions, we use breakout groups. We, as of yesterday, struck 4 more breakout groups, but I should note that we already had 2 breakout groups based on early discussion and focus of the advisory council. We had one on climate change already underway, looking at how we can move that forward. And now we've been more focused in that. We've split out climate change into 2 specific topics, and we'll go after it. The other one was on codes or on standards that are referenced in the codes, how we can do that more effectively, and also look at standards with regards to climate change and how those could be leveraged to move forward. So these four here, accessibility, climate change, and performance-based codes, are new working groups. Those are also open for attendance. They're public meetings. So again, in those times of those meetings of those working groups will be posted on our site. So a lot of work to do. We see that a readiness of the advisory council to provide that advice as needed to the board is something that we want to stay ahead of. Very passionate people involved, and looking through the summer months here to prepare for what will be a busy September and meetings coming up. Again, it's an ongoing dialogue. I think what's exciting is, although we've set quite a bit of the roadmap at a high level, there's pieces to be put in and filled in. So the role of the advisory council to provide insight on that to the usefulness of the board is very important. So I think that's the last one, or is there one more? That is it. So I will stop there. Thank you for your time. And I guess we turn it back to the chairs.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Kevin and Sefton and Thomas and Marianne, for really richly insightful, wonderful presentations today. We have a bit of time for questions before we wrap this meeting in about 13 minutes or so. And I guess I would ask for people to signal either using sort of that hands up function or coming on screen and waving for questions. We will try to leave close to 5 minutes at the end for a couple concluding remarks, or 2 or 3 minutes at least. So other questions, otherwise I may also go through to the chat, and we'll see. There are, now that people aren't presenting, it is quite helpful to go and see. So a number of the comments. I did see one comment from Christine Callahoo about the Canadian Institute of Planners should perhaps also participate in the advisory council with a specific focus upon the wildland urban interface and asset management planning, etc. I don't know if there's a comment response to that. Otherwise, David Lapp offered, our former co-chair of this group, has offered a long comment. I won't recite that, but it speaks to good points. And Elise Pare has offered some good updates. Anything there, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. Happy to respond, Chad. The land use development side that will interface with the solutions around wildland and urban interface, for example, WUI issues. Yeah, very front and center, overland flooding. All these issues have historically potentially been managed through those folks. So again, I think it's complementary, and we certainly would welcome participation by those from the planning sector at this time. Again, can attend as observers. We have tapped into, we have the Canadian Association of Urban Municipalities. And as of course, planners play a very key role in city planning, and our members, or could be members through that, and represent through that opportunity as well, comments up to our council. So great point. And I think that touches on a few other points that were made, that I don't think there's one silver bullet to solve the climate change issue. Codes are part of it. And I think we're looking at, it's an effort on many pieces of legislation and many opportunities to provide a move forward. So it's a great point.
Thank you for that. Any other comments from our speakers in light to anything they may have seen come up in the chat or wish to add in light of what they've heard other speakers say? Otherwise, I know we're starting to lose people, so permit me to enter a parenthesis and just say, as we mentioned earlier on in our meeting, we certainly would invite people to add your name to the Infrastructure and Buildings Working Group directory of members. And there's a link in the chat already posted. So just wanted to recite that we really do value people entering their membership information there, as this will become a publicly available, accessible database of really leading infrastructure, buildings, construction, and other built environment professionals working across sectors. And I'm thankful to all of the participants who have tuned in today. I tried to give a moment there for any other questions. I see two more items have popped up on the chat. The directory. Yes, Dan?
I had one question for the, that might help our membership a bit in terms of planning and priorities. And I think it was Septon that pointed out there's a pretty short timeline with respect to submitting code change requests for 2030. And I believe those have to be in before June. So basically 1 year from this month, if you wanted something considered for 2030. And I'm wondering if maybe Thomas and Septon could outline or identify resources for this community for what a good code change request look like. For example, how do you frame a code change request so it meets those criteria you mentioned before, that it's, it's a widespread need, it's something the industry is ready to move on, and so on. And if there's no resource, can we come back to you and receive some guidance?
Sefton, I think that's in your wheelhouse. So I'll put that over to you. I think that the staff can help certainly in how to best articulate things, and I think from what I know, it's important to clearly articulate the problem. If a solution can be provided, and that's a proposed approach can be provided, that's all to the better. But I'll let Septon speak to it because he has lots of experience in this aspect.
Yeah, I posted the link to the website, which is, again, it's the CCBFC website, so it will soon migrate to a CBHCC website with a new link. You could go to this old link and it would redirect you to the new one anyway. But in there, when you're going to submit a code change request, it actually walks you through the different pieces of information that will be asked. There's a whole form that you fill out, and it asks for a wide range of I'll say bits of information that not everyone has. We get code change requests from industry that is well supported through research that they've developed ahead of the code change requests, that has been maybe socialized through the different industries before it ever comes to us. We also get code change requests that come to us from individuals of subject matter experts. We also get code change requests from people like my mother, who doesn't know anything about how to build anything, and she can submit a code change request, and they're all sort of viewed equally, and they'll have a different range of information that's provided in the code change request. So the document that I'm talking about is sort of like the landing page or the splash page for submitting a code change request, walks you through the different questions that will be asked in the form and the different pieces of information that they're looking for. But I would say, like, a well thought out complete code change request would have different elements that we speak to, clarifying the issue that needs to be addressed in the code, clarifying what objectives those would address that are currently within scope of the code. If outside the scope of the code, you'd want to clearly explain that this fits outside the scope of the code and justify why you think that should be then in scope of code. You would want to provide any research that would substantiate your proposal. It asks you what requirements in the code you would like to see modified or add new, and what your proposed solution to that problem that you identified would be. It asks for information on any available information you have on, say, the costs or the benefits of that proposal that you put for the proposed solution that you put forward. But really, the best advice that I could give, that I think makes a code change request easy to process through the code system, is really spending a lot of time defining the problem. Because if the problem is well defined, then as the technical committees start looking at this, they'll identify the same problems that you're trying to raise through the code change request. And then once they get the ball rolling, they start understanding the problem, and they can understand how to solve it if the code is going to play a piece. So really, when I describe what makes a good code change request, I really put a lot of emphasis on defining what the problem is and substantiating why you think that is an issue and why that is a problem. But yeah, if you want more information, you go to the link that I showed. There's a drop-down menu. You can go and look at how to get involved, and one of them is submit a code change request, and you can see more information there.
This is really helpful, and I hope that I know that our members, I've seen a number of comments here, really appreciating the participation today. Excuse me, it's the wildfire smoke or something causing my words to fumble here, but there are points here, like David Lapp and Christine Callaghan are making in the comments, and actually Andrew Crease, I wanted to encourage you also to come online if you wish. I can't see hands up from my screen. Maybe I'll start with Andrew in the moments we have.
Sure, and I can't tell if my camera's on or not. Can you see me?
Yep, it's on.
Very good. I can't see myself, so forgive me. But this is what Marianne started with, and this comment has sort of permeated the conversation today. In that, how are we, how do we best leverage sort of innovations and best practices that go beyond minimum code, that aren't necessarily best suited for the code, that are sort of outside the code, and some people said there are other options other than the code, and maybe something we all need to collectively think about is how do we optimize those other options, for fast pickup of innovative stuff, this is something we've been thinking about. But is there sort of best practice about what to do with best practices? Ideas about how to bring innovation to the mainstream as quickly as possible. Do we have a way to think about that? Because historically, we've always sort of thrown everything in the code. Now we're thinking about, how to keep things outside of the code. Marianne, I think you mentioned toolkits, but are there, is there sort of thinking about how to do that?
That's great. I know that we've talked about the National Master Construction Specifications once in passing, but I'll turn it over to our presenters. Any of them wish to go first to respond to this?
And maybe I'll comment generally and then turn it over to Marianne to finally close the full circle. So generally, the way we've been thinking about codes internally at the NRC is they kind of come at a late adoption stage, if you will. And so for in the early phases, you kind of start with guidelines and you have your early adopters who are looking to really push the envelope. And so we're into pilot projects and looking at ways of applying things in that way. Then as you go, you can develop standards. Standards could be adopted in a local area to address a particular problem or something like that, working with municipalities, et cetera. A little bit more nimble than the overall code instrument, which takes long, as was discussed. Then NMS, thanks Chad for flagging that one. I was going to say that federally, it's our system of specifications that are mandated for federal construction. So there's an opportunity to de-risk and try things at a federal level there that we're looking at using as an instrument. And then kind of the codes kind of comes along, having built upon a lot of the experience and industry upskilling in different areas to and new products coming on the market and such to really kind of set a new minimum bar that's potentially higher in order to enforce across the board. And so we like to think of the codes a bit at the back end amongst a nuanced array and kind of spectrum of activities that really are informed quite a bit by the outputs from research programs such as what Marianne's running. So Marianne, over to you for any additional color.
I think there's a big long list of things we can talk about in terms of other things we can do before the codes. I mean, things like land planning, incentive programs, targeting existing buildings. As we know, resilience strikes the most vulnerable populations who are not necessarily in the new buildings, which we would cover with codes. A good one for bringing information up or to sort of de-risk the solutions, including the guidance and the technologies, is to work on pilot studies. So I think this is a really good route forward, is to have those example studies where we said, yeah, we used the wildfire guideline or we used a flood barrier and it works. So it comes to building that knowledge within industry, that acceptance within the public towards moving towards these solutions. And that will also ultimately eliminate a lot of the barriers when it comes to regulation. So if people are familiar with this and know it works and industry is ready for it, it's a lot easier to adopt rather than asking to regulate from the start. So as Thomas says, it's something that tends to bring up the rear end. So the more we can do of that de-risking, that demonstration, that education piece, it's going to go a long way to help supporting moving everyone, including industry, along towards resilience.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, that was great, Andrew, because it also spoke to points that David and Christine raised. Any other questions here Daryl Daniluk also makes a good point about concern with going beyond code can raise potential legal issues in the chat. So really rich discussion here. We're really at time now. Dan, I would like to turn to you, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, maybe we can close out the meeting. It's 12:30 now. Thanks very much, Chad, for leading the discussion. Thanks for everyone and their great questions and comments. And thank you very much to the presenters, Thomas, Septon, Kevin, Marianne. Always great to hear from Marianne. Thank you. We understand that you're very busy, but this is a very important topic to bring to this audience. And I'm sure the discussion will be shared widely, and we'll share your slides and a recording of the presentation and so on. And it will be very useful for others that are interested in this topic. So thank you once again for participating today. As always, for future meetings, Chad and I are always very open to your suggestions. So please feel free to reach out anytime. I think we actually have some recommendations coming right now, which are pilot studies, application of practices beyond code, and so on. This is something that we can certainly talk about in future meetings. And so feel free to reach out anytime. Fill out the memory directory if you have time. And with that, maybe we'll end it there, and we'll see you in October. So thanks again, everyone.